He smelled it before he understood it. A sharp chemical odor drifting down into the trench where he was crouching, where all of them were crouching. 150 American prisoners, packed into 3 concrete shelters, waiting out what the guards had told them was an air raid drill. Then the smell hit him. Aviation fuel. He'd been working around that smell for 2 years. He knew it instantly. And so did every other man in those shelters. The screaming started before the torch came in. What happened next, on that remote Philippine island, on the afternoon of December 14, 1944, would send a shockwave all the way to the desk of General Douglas MacArthur. It would force him to make the most urgent decisions of his entire Pacific campaign. And it would set off a race against time to save thousands of American prisoners still alive across the Philippines. But first, 139 men had to die. These weren't green soldiers fresh off a transport ship. Most of these men had been prisoners for over 2 years. They had survived the fall of Bataan. They had survived the death march, days on foot without food or water, under a killing sun, guards bayoneting anyone who fell behind. They had survived camps near Manila where men died in double digits every single day. Now they were on a jungle island building an airstrip for the Japanese, barefoot, half-starved, working from before dawn until after dark. But something had changed lately. American planes had started appearing in the sky, bombers, multiple times a day, hitting the very airfield these men had built with their bare hands. They couldn't celebrate openly, but they felt it. Help was coming. One morning, a young Marine named Glenn, one of the longest-serving prisoners in the camp, looked at his closest friend on the work detail, Smitty. "We might actually make it out of here." His friend watched the sky for a moment. "Something is going on," he said quietly. "What the hell do you think is happening?" Neither man had an answer, but both of them had learned to read the guards. And the guards were nervous. That should have been a warning. What those men didn't know was that their fate had already been decided. Months earlier, a written order had gone out to every Japanese prison camp commander in the Philippines. It was short. It was unambiguous. Dispose of them as the situation dictates. Annihilate them all and leave no traces. The order had been sitting in a file, waiting for the right moment. MacArthur's landing on Leyte in October 1944 was that moment. MacArthur had actually warned the Japanese command months earlier, put it in writing, that any harm to Allied prisoners would be treated as a war crime. The warning was delivered, acknowledged, and ignored. On Palawan, the garrison commander received his instructions and began to prepare. The prisoners painted American prisoner of war camp on the roof of their barracks. They thought it would protect them. They were wrong. The guards woke them at 2 in the morning. That was the first sign something was wrong. The routine never changed at 2 in the morning. Several of the men exchanged looks in the darkness, but said nothing. They were marched to the airfield. As Glenn worked, he scanned the perimeter. More guards than usual, all of them watching, weapons ready. He looked at his friend. His friend had already noticed. Then, at mid-afternoon, the air raid siren wailed. The camp commander stepped forward and looked at the assembled prisoners. "Americans," he said, "your working days are over." For one brief, extraordinary moment, most of the men thought that meant liberation, that MacArthur was close, that the Japanese were surrendering. 1 or 2 of them actually smiled. They ran for the air raid shelters. 3 concrete trenches dug into the earth at the edge of a 60-foot cliff, the very shelters they had been forced to build weeks earlier. Glenn ran for the shelter closest to the cliff. He didn't know yet that that single choice would save his life. The men crowded in. The openings went dark as the guards moved to stand over them. Then came the sloshing sound. Then the smell. Aviation fuel poured from buckets directly into the trench. Every man in that shelter understood at the same moment. Some screamed. Some rushed the opening. Some prayed. A flaming torch dropped in, and then there were no more words, only sound. Glenn was at the far end of the trench, closest to the cliff face. The heat was already unbearable. The men around him were on fire. One of them, a medic, already burning, turned and found Glenn's eyes in the chaos. He pointed at a gap in the rocks at the base of the shelter wall. Glenn and his friend tore at the rocks with their bare hands. Fingernails splitting, palms bleeding. 2 more men joined them. They ripped the gap open. They ran straight off the cliff into darkness. The drop was 60 feet. Glenn hit the water and went under. When he surfaced, he could see the flames above him on the cliff. He could hear the machine guns. guards stationed at the wire, waiting for survivors. He could hear the patrol boats on the water, shooting at anything that moved. He forced himself to stay completely still. Above him, the screaming slowly faded. When the darkness was finally full and silent, he dragged himself to shore. He found the camp garbage dump. He crawled inside it, pulled debris over himself, lay there through the night while the search parties moved up and down the beach with their lights. He didn't move until dawn. In the morning, Glenn believed he was alone. He had no idea his friend had gone over the cliff right beside him, burned and bleeding, and then swum 5 miles across open water in the dark. A shark hit him during the crossing. He fought it off and kept swimming. He reached the far shore and collapsed in the sand. Glenn had no idea that another man had wedged himself into a narrow crack in the cliff rocks below the shelters, barely wide enough to breathe, and spent hours listening to the killing above him. The stench of burning drifting down into the crevice where he was hiding. By the grace of God, he would later say, I was overlooked. Glenn had no idea that another survivor had been shot twice and was still crawling along the beach in the dark, hiding behind rocks, watching Japanese search parties execute other men one by one as they found them. He had no idea that another man was alone in the jungle, moving only at night, evading patrols, surviving on almost nothing for 10 straight days. What Glenn didn't know, what none of the survivors knew, was that as darkness fell that evening, the Japanese guards on the beach conducted their count. 149. One of the survivors hiding in the water nearby heard the count. He thought he was the only one left alive. He was wrong, but barely. Of the 150 men at Camp 10A, 11 survived. One by one over the following days, Filipino civilians found them, hid them in their homes, fed them, kept them alive at enormous personal risk. On Christmas Eve, Glenn was being guided through the jungle hills by a small group of Filipino escorts. Below them, a village glowed with the light of cooking fires. The Filipinos stopped walking, and without warning, quietly in the darkness of the jungle, they began to sing, God Bless America. Glenn broke down completely, couldn't stop it, didn't try. One of the Filipinos put a hand on his arm and said, very carefully, my friends, you are now in the free Philippines, but the danger was far from over. Because somewhere in the Pacific, a guerrilla unit was sending a radio message, and nobody yet knew if anyone would believe it. The message reached Allied headquarters in late December. It was brief. American prisoners had survived a massacre at Camp 10A on Palawan. 1 in 39 were dead. A handful were hiding with Filipino guerrillas. The report was immediately classified top secret, and then MacArthur's intelligence officers did something that almost made everything worse. They doubted it. They had been receiving reports from guerrilla units for months, some accurate, many exaggerated. And this particular report, that Japanese guards had calmly, methodically burned American prisoners alive, seemed almost too extreme to accept without verification. They sent a flying boat anyway. A PBY Catalina with a fighter escort flying 850 miles over Japanese-held territory to collect 6 of the survivors. The plane landed. The survivors were helped aboard. They were flown to a small island south of the Philippines. And on January 7, 1945, one of those survivors sat down across from an Army intelligence captain. The captain had a notepad, a pen, a practiced professional expression. He began with routine questions. The survivor answered all of them. Then the captain asked him to describe what had happened on December 14th. He described it: the sirens, the fuel, the torches, the cliff, the water, the search parties with their lights, the sound of the count from the beach. The captain asked clarifying questions, asked the same things more than once in different ways. The survivor understood. He kept answering, kept going back over it, every detail. At some point, the captain's pen stopped moving. He stared at the page. When he looked up, his face was different. He didn't ask any more questions. He just closed the notepad. What happened next would determine whether thousands of other Americans lived or died. The full report reached MacArthur in early January 1945. He was deep in the middle of the Luzon campaign. His forces had landed at Lingayen Gulf and were grinding south toward Manila. 200,000 soldiers, brutal resistance. Every day, a new crisis, a new decision. He didn't have time for this, and then he read the order. Not just the massacre. The written Japanese directive: annihilate them all. Leave no traces. that had been in effect across every prison camp in the Philippines since October. MacArthur set the report down. He was a man who had been fighting in the Pacific since the first days of the war. He had seen things clearly when clarity was inconvenient before. He saw this clearly now. Palawan hadn't been an isolated atrocity, it had been a test run. And right now, in camps across Luzon, there were thousands of Americans still alive, survivors of Bataan. Men who had been prisoners for 3 years. Men with families at home who still wrote letters addressed to PBABU camps, not knowing if they'd ever be answered. If the Japanese followed the same order on Luzon, and they had every reason to, none of those men would be alive when MacArthur's army arrived. A guerrilla commander had already sent an urgent warning. Over 500 prisoners at a camp called Cabanatuan were showing signs of being moved, or worse. The Japanese might be sending them to Japan. Or they might be doing what they'd done on Palawan. MacArthur looked at the intelligence. He looked at his campaign map. He looked at the clock. Then he gave the order. Go get them. January 28, 1945. A young ranger captain received his mission in plain language. 500 American prisoners. A camp 30 miles behind Japanese lines. No vehicles. No air cover. Go in tonight. Bring them out. He had 120 men. They moved out after dark on foot in silence. No lights, no talking. The guerrillas led them through rice paddies and jungle trails, around Japanese positions, across ground the enemy thought they controlled completely. 30 miles, every step a risk, every sound a potential catastrophe. If a single Japanese patrol spotted them and got word to the camp, the prisoners would be dead before the Rangers reached the wire. 2 days earlier, a small reconnaissance team had gone in ahead of them. They had been lying in the grass outside the camp for 48 hours, counting guards, timing patrol rotations, marking positions, sending coded reports back. On the night of January 30th, the Rangers reached their position, 500 yards from the perimeter, and lay flat in the tall grass. The sun went down. Inside that camp, more than 500 Americans had been prisoners for almost 3 years. They were walking skeletons, most of them sick, some barely able to stand. All of them aware, because word traveled through the Philippines, that something had happened at a place called Palawan, and that whatever had happened there could happen here. They didn't know that 120 Rangers were lying in the grass outside their wire right now. They didn't know that tomorrow, some of them would be going home. At dusk, a single American fighter plane made one low pass over the camp. The guards looked up at the sky. The Rangers came through the wire. The firefight lasted 30 minutes. When it was over, every guard was dead, and 500 American prisoners were just standing in the open, blinking in the night air, trying to understand what had just happened. Most of them couldn't walk. 3 years of starvation had taken that from them. Some had to be carried. Filipino civilians appeared out of the surrounding dark, men and women from the nearby villages, pushing wooden carts, offering their arms, carrying strangers towards safety without being asked. A ranger knelt beside a prisoner who couldn't get up from the ground. The man was skin and bone, somewhere in his early 30s, though he looked 60. "Can you stand, sir?" The man stared at the American flag on the ranger's shoulder. He hadn't seen one in 3 years. He couldn't find words. He just grabbed the ranger's arm and held on. 512 men were carried, walked, or wheeled out of Cabanatuan that night. The column moved through the darkness, the guerrillas holding the roads on either side. 2 Rangers were killed. 1 prisoner died of a heart attack on the march. Everyone else made it to American lines by dawn. Some of the freed men sat down in the road when they arrived, just sat down. Not because they were hurt, because they needed a moment to believe it was real. MacArthur wasn't finished. What followed was one of the most concentrated rescue operations in the history of American warfare. MacArthur launched 4 raids in 30 days. 3 days after Cabanatuan, American tanks crashed through the gates of a Manila university being used as an internment camp. 3,000 civilians, Americans, British, others who had been held for years, walked out into daylight. The day after that, a prison in Manila was opened. More prisoners freed, and then came Los Baños, a camp south of Manila. 2,000 prisoners. Enemy soldiers on every road leading in. No clean approach, no margin for error. The plan required paratroopers dropping from the sky, amphibious vehicles coming across a lake, guerrilla forces attacking from the jungle, and Alamo scouts hitting the guards, all at the exact same moment, at dawn. One thing out of sync and the prisoners died. Everything hit at once. Every single prisoner at Los Baños was evacuated under fire. Every one of them, 30 days. 4 camps, more than 7,000 American and Allied prisoners alive. All of it tracing back to 11 men in the water off a cliff on Palawan. When American forces retook Palawan, MacArthur went to the camp. He walked through what remained: the wire, the shelters, the scorched earth, the cliff edge where men had jumped into the dark. Medical teams were already working when he arrived, carefully, methodically excavating the remains of 139 Americans from the ground. There are no recorded words from MacArthur during that visit, only photographs. In every one of them, his face is still, controlled, not giving anything away. The face of a man who has looked at the cost of war before and knows the only right response is to keep looking. He stood there and he looked. These men had painted American prisoner of war camp on their roof because they still believed the rules of war meant something. They had died waiting for help that arrived 23 days too late. In 1952, their remains came home. 123 of them were laid to rest together in a mass grave at a national cemetery outside St. Louis. They are still there. Glenn came home to Iowa. He became a highway patrolman, then a county sheriff. He married, raised children, lived quietly for decades. For years, he said almost nothing about Palawan. Not to his wife, not to his children. But he carried it every single day: the garbage dump, the darkness, the Christmas Eve hillside, and the Filipinos singing. The number floating up from the beach in the dark: 149. When a memorial was finally built at the site of Camp 10A, Glenn went back. He was in his 80s. He stood on the ground where it happened, where men he had known since 1942 had died, where, for a reason he never fully claimed to understand, he had not. One researcher spent years studying what those 11 survivors had set in motion. His conclusion was precise. The first 6 men rescued from Palawan, the men who sat down across from skeptical intelligence officers and told their story until they were believed, helped save more than 3,600 lives. By the time all 4 raids were complete, that number had grown past 7,000. 7,000 people, sons, fathers, husbands. Men whose families were still writing letters to prison camps. All of it started with 11 men going over a cliff. All of it continued because Filipino men and women kept those 11 men alive at the risk of their own lives. All of it moved because one survivor sat across from a captain who didn't believe him and kept talking until he did. And all of it happened because a general with a war to win looked at the report from Palawan, understood in an instant what it meant for thousands of men he'd never met, and decided that not a single day could be wasted. He sent people in, and mostly they came back.